welcome back to Business Mastery for Startups, Scale-Ups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me, and this week, I'm super excited to have an extremely experienced person, both in the investor side of the house and the startup, small business side of the house, Patrick Donohue. Patrick, would you please introduce yourself and maybe give a little more info than I did?
Sure, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here. I always love talking about entrepreneurship and founders and how they can build value. So your work is very important. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So, Jerry, the one thing I always think about is I, like most people, started out selling lemonade with my cousin Chad. I actually keep a picture of it on my desk. And so I think about this a lot when we were
That's
little
awesome.
kids and 10 cents at the time. But I think about that a lot because the journey of entrepreneurship always starts with that spark. And for me, that spark was with my parents and my grandparents and my grandfather in particular, who owned a drive-in and had many other what kids or young people today would call side hustles. So that's where it all got started for me, a real love for entrepreneurship. And today I get to not only an entrepreneur myself, but I also get to invest in and support entrepreneurs in my daily business.
Before we move on, I'd love to hear just a little bit more about that because you've got a really exciting background, again, sitting on both sides of the fence. Could we talk a little bit more about your startup experience as well as your investment?
Sure. So probably pushing 20 years ago, I had started a couple of businesses when I went out on my own. So my background started going into a traditional job doing securities analysis, so writing research and then doing investment banking, so IPOs, merger acquisition work. But then I went out on my own and started a couple businesses. Um, Both of those businesses kind of live on today, basically. The first is Inspiration Medical Technology. That business is being run this day by my co-founder. And then my other business was DealPen, which we built a series of courses to teach entrepreneurs about finance and how to capitalize and support the growth in their business. And that business doesn't live on today, of course, but ironically, I'm utilizing a lot of that early knowledge and what we do day to day in Hill Capital, and was really an impetus for writing the book Breakout Valuation. So it all does come full circle, that's for sure.
There are so many similarities in our background. For those of you
Yes.
listening instead of watching, Patrick and I appear to be similar ages. We both, alas, tell stories that started 20 years ago, which is a stage of life I don't love being in. but we're both authors. Now Patrick's background, it seems to be, and again, correct me if I'm misunderstanding, more on business building from the sales and operations side. Whereas mine, though I have a lot of sales background, it's really more on the building the people side. So,
Exactly.
so that's pretty interesting. We're both published authors, which is interesting as well. Now, your first startup, did you exit that, or did you leave? How did?
No, that business is operating today.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah,
That
and
is
so
awesome.
that's really fun. And that's what's really neat about what we do at Hill Capital Corporation. We structure our investments so we don't have to rely upon a founder selling the business for cash. Because that's the challenge when somebody takes angel and VC money, is they have to be ready and have a plan to sell that business in, 5 to 7 years for cash. Because that's the only thing that moves the needle.
Right.
And so it leaves out a lot of companies. We call it the capital gap, but a lot of companies are boxed out of being able to access capital because they may not want to sell. And companies like I founded with Steve Miller continue to live on. And I don't. Maybe Steve will want to sell it someday. I'm neutral at best. I'd love to hold on to it, but a lot of entrepreneurs want to hold on to their businesses because it's fun. That's what motivates me every day, is to get up and work on Hill Capital and do the things I love to do. And I would have a hard time with the whole idea that it would just be sold someday because for me, retirement for me looks like what Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger have done. It's getting up and just dancing to work every day, being excited about what you do because I don't sit on a beach too long. So,
I'll skip the cheeseburger, but other than that, I'm in complete alignment because, gosh, I think we might have talked to them about this before, but my dad's 76, works a blue collar job. I grew up in a blue collar world. I started working on a farm when I was 9 years old. If I retired, I'm pretty sure my dad would disown me. I just can't imagine a world,
yeah, exactly.
yeah, where that happens. And frankly, I love what I do. And you describe a problem. So I'm pretty active in both the VC angel investment world and the bootstrapping world.
Yes.
And some folks will bootstrap until they need VC funding, and they'll take that VC funding because they need it to hit the next stage of growth, or at least believe that they do. And you're right, for a lot of folks, the idea isn't build it to sell. And I've been down that road. Apicero, we sold in 5 years. But gosh, I don't know that I would want that for myself or for my other company. And I think for a lot of folks, they don't want that.
Well, I wrote about it in the book. I mean, what's fascinating, I've been doing what I do in some way, shape, or form for pushing 30 years. And the most eye-opening things I've ever seen, Jerry, is when an entrepreneur sells their business and then, they go play for a while or, get caught up on the things that's important to them in life. But all of a sudden, 12, 18 months go by and they start looking around. They're buying another business or they're investing in other businesses or they're starting something up. And it's I've seen it a number of times, and the only reason it's sad, it's great that they're chasing the purpose, but it's really sad. I've seen a number of times where they all of a sudden wake up one morning, they have the realization where they just regret having sold what they had before, because they also have come to the realization that they're sinking so much money into the new startup or whatever they're working on. They start to remember how hard it was to build a high quality business. And unfortunately, I've also seen a few times where entrepreneurs, had money and set for life, and then they couldn't sit still and start plowing it back into other things. And then, as they got older, all of a sudden they didn't have the cash that they needed to fully retire like they expected. So I think it's really important, and I encourage entrepreneurs to really think through what they want to accomplish long term. Again, nothing wrong if they want to build it to sell. That's great, and that works. But for a lot of entrepreneurs, they may want to hand it over to their kids or to the employees someday and so forth. And those are all valid. And our ecosystem should support that. And that's what we do as capital providers.
100%. And it's interesting too. So I've done the exited founder route, and I've
Yeah.
consulted into companies that didn't want to go that way. So in my prior life, my old company, I took senior executive roles typically for about 18 months to help companies get past whatever hurdle is that they need help with. But it's interesting because you describe it, and money aside, you describe a
Right.
problem that I don't think a lot of people think through, and that's that the first 3 to 5 years of a startup, while exciting, we typically remember it as being exciting in the rear view. But when you're in it, it's pants on fire, crazy town.
Right. Exactly.
It's the hard part. And then you get to the place where your business is stable enough that you can start having more, maybe not exactly, but more that 9 to 5 life. And what do? You sell it and reset back to crazy pants on fire time.
Exactly. Yeah, very much so.
So I'm sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Well, I was just going to make a comment. I mean, the journey is really the fun, right? I mean, the destination's always an illusion on the horizon. You got to get up every day enjoying the journey. That's what moves the needle.
100% yes. And as somebody again who's been on the founder and operation side of the business as well as investment, what advice do you give companies, really, whether bootstrapped or funded, to make sure that the companies they're building, are going to be successful, are valuable enough to either A, build enough infrastructure that they can run them indefinitely and not work 90 hours a week, or B, sell them if that's the destiny they choose?
Yeah, great question. And it's funny because ever since I wrote the book Breakout Valuation, my response to this has changed quite a bit. And it's because one of the value drivers I talked about in the book has now become my mainstay, and that's a magnetic vision. So historically, I would have talked much more about like the tactical things that one needs to think about for running the business and operating it. But I think what's really important, what I've come to fully appreciate, is how important it is for the founder or founders to really have that vision, but just not a vision, but to make it magnetic so it attracts other people to help and support the journey of that vision manifesting into reality. And that looks like internally, with the team, and even how you think about like attracting vendors, because vendors would rather work with a high quality company that's building and growing so you can get better terms. Employees would rather stick with a growing business. But then also it matters to build value in the business long term. And again, it's not about selling the business. That's what we all think about, and it definitely pertains to that, but it's also about making sure that business is valuable. So if you do want to hand it over to the next generation, they can do that. But that magnetic vision is really the glue that ties all these things together and can really help align all the resources necessary for those founders and the team to be able to execute long term. So that's what I really think about a lot these days as it comes to your question, Jerry.
No, for sure. And that concept of magnetic leadership and magnetic vision, I think, is critical. So, one of the things I talk about with founders and owners is the EFG leadership framework.
Yes.
E for engage, F for fulfillment, and G for growth. And it's the G part in most companies, if it's run well and the leader is engaging and fulfilling his teams, that things break. Meaning that the person they hired, they don't have the opportunity to grow in their skills or their responsibilities in their current role. And there's not a next step for them. At that point, there's not a reason for them to stay. But if they have a magnetic vision, they're continuing to grow, that's much less likely going to be the case.
Yeah, and I think that's why that magnetic vision really helps with that growth, because your work is absolutely spot on, and your book Destination Employer is to really help think through EFG, and that growth piece is really important because either you're growing or dying. And I mentioned
Yes.
this in my book. I mean, it's the old saying, but it's absolutely true, because if you're not growing, the opposite is you're stagnant at best. And people want to be around things that are building and are growing and are exciting. And so I think that's the reality I've had, as simple as it sounds, it's absolutely foundational for everything else, because we could nerd out and talk about cash flows and optimizing this, that, and the other thing. But if we don't have that foundation laid, we can't get to the other things around optimizing how that business can grow, I
Yes,
think.
I agree. And I work predominantly in the technology cybersecurity space. And if you're a technologist working at a company and you're not growing, you're killing your career. Your value in the
Yeah.
marketplace is dropping. If you're working on 2 iterations ago of a programming language, you have real risk when you go back to the marketplace because your skills aren't current. And
Yes.
secondly, for the company, and this is tech or not tech, it doesn't matter. The
No.
secret sauce is momentum. And if you have no growth, you have no momentum. You're again, it's a hard story to sell when you're trying to, again, especially B2B. Most of the work I do is B2B. When you're trying to explain to that potential client of yours why they should work with you, and you've got no momentum story to tell, it's a tough sell.
Very much so. Completely agree. Yeah. And the reality is a lot of times entrepreneurs don't really think through all of that, because it sounds really fluffy on the front end, but it's absolutely critical to the whole growth trajectory and everything that that entrepreneur wants to achieve through their journey.
I will say perhaps the least sexy business book I have ever read, though it's still my number one and will always be, is Seven Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And
Yes, of course.
it's a masterpiece. And I give it to every high school graduate, every college graduate, everybody I work with. It's required reading in my company. It's 10 out of 10. It's not fascinating reading. And Dr. Covey, amazing writer that he is not a riveting reader if you go the audiobook route either. But tough through it. It's worth every second you invest. But I've got to say, beginning with the end in mind is probably the
Yes.
single thing that has got me or kept me out of more pickles than anything else. And you just described it to a T. And it's hard when you're a startup founder because everything is a 10 on the 1 out of 10 scale in importance because everything is good and bad happening at the same time.
Yeah, exactly, and absolutely agree with Covey's work. I mean, absolutely foundational, and of course, it was the whole breeding ground for what became the entrepreneurial operating system and a whole
Yes.
bunch of other things. But everybody's utilizing his core work around utilizing rocks and so on and so forth. But the one thing that really comes to mind with beginning with the end in mind for me is it's one thing to have that as the founder, but what I've come to appreciate, and I think it's really understated in a lot of the business world, but how important it is to not only be able to communicate it, but to truly communicate it and to bring people along with you. And so that's when I was writing the book. I had heard a speaker, Jack Daly, that I think very, very highly of. And Jack was talking about things being magnetic, and that's where that aha moment went off for me. To that really tied all this together is that that vision really has to be magnetic to bring other people along. And that's how I think about the work I do, and would encourage entrepreneurs to really think about how they're conveying to others how they're utilizing beginning with the end in mind.
100% yes. And I think your role shifts a little bit as founder, and your responsibility shift a little bit as founder as the organization grows. In the very beginning, you're chief cook and bottle washer all in one. You're touching everything, and you're using your founder superpower to get things done. And that's, in my opinion, not only the way it typically is, but also the way it needs to be in the beginning.
Sure.
However,
Yes.
when you grow to a certain point, that I need to touch everything because it becomes a detriment, because you go from superpowered individual to the bottleneck of everything. And I think at that point, and there's no point where you described isn't important, but when you reach that point, it becomes critically important, because you start to lose the capacity to influence things directly, and your ability to draw people and develop that layer of leadership under yourself is what keeps that engine moving, keeps that flywheel turning. At least that's been my observation.
Yeah, and what came to mind, Jerry, I was at actually a funeral the other day for a former teacher of mine that I think highly of, and in the homily they were talking about how he was really big into uniting people, and they had kind of his four ways that he did that. But the one that I was thinking about as you were talking, Jerry, was talking about enabling others to be successful. And I wrote that down, and I really like that term, that phrase, enabling others to be successful, because I think for a lot of founders, and I've suffered from that too, where founders get scared to enable others to be successful because they think, if that, then this, meaning then others will be able to copy what I do or go build their other business or whatever the case may be. And I think when founders really learn to elevate and delegate and to enable others to be successful, that's where the magic happens.
100%.
And yeah, and so I think a lot about that is really building out the team, and why your work is so important to really think about how to build culture and to be that destination employer. That's really empowering others to be successful.
And Patrick, I think the easiest way to think about it for me is teams are a lot like habits. So when
Yes.
you're looking to break a habit, it's not something that happens automatically. You have to really concentrate on that until the new thing replaces the old thing, because nobody really breaks habits, they replace them. So if I'm
Yep.
trying to get back in shape, clearly something I should consider, then it's not that I break my fast food or my beer on the weekends habit. It's that I replace that with something else that I derive pleasure from. And ultimately, what happens is, as you start to do the new thing, do the new thing, it becomes a habit and becomes the old thing, and your new habit makes you. Teams are the same way, in my opinion. You pour your energy into your team just the way you would a habit, and that team makes you. If you do it right, the team makes you a success. Do it wrong, alas, the inverse is also true. But that team, gosh, again, I come predominantly from a sales and recruiting background. So for me, that transition to sales manager earlier in my career, that shifting my mentality to focusing on output for my own success, and pushing that to a team that ultimately brought me to a higher level, that was a big transition to make.
Yeah, very much so. And the thing that came to mind, as you mentioned, habits and so forth. I love the work by B.J. Fogg out of Stanford called Tiny Habits, is the book he wrote. And then also a lot of people are big fans of James Clear and Atomic Habits. But um, that was really that played a big role in my life and how I think about business as well, when those bodies of work really came out a number of years ago. But to think about things in that first little step.
Yeah.
So exactly right, you have to replace it with something, and you have to have something that is the catalyst, the tipping point. And I think that's a really important mindset and opportunity for founders in particular to think about where they're going and how they're going to get there, but what are the tiny things that they can do on the front end to help set the pace to where they want to ultimately go.
100% yes. You make your habits, then they make you. You make your teams, then they make you. But when you begin with a mindful thought and intention with the end in mind, it's just easier to do that. The other
Very
thing
much.
I'd like to talk, you mentioned culture. I think that's important when you're building a valuable company, is understanding one of the truths about human nature, and that's that different things drive us. So one of the mistakes I see in startups very often is when folks are hiring for their teams, they're thinking too far down the line. And the problem with that is that folks are very often most drawn to an organization at a certain place in its life cycle. Said
Yeah.
differently, lots of folks have a startup mentality. They thrive in that high energy, volatile culture. And then as the startup matures and it becomes more staid and codified, things become more defined. That's just not them. So while some of them will very much stay through and take the journey with you, some of those folks are going to look for exits. And it's not a flaw of theirs. It's that the culture and workplace is no longer a match to their personality. That dynamic thing is gone. And I'm sorry to go too long
Yeah.
here, but this is one of the things I think we have to be mindful of as founders is somebody might be your Mr. or Mrs. Right today, but not tomorrow. And we have to be okay with that change. Whereas some folks, they'll grow and change with the organization.
Yeah, and as the finance guy, what goes through my mind is the money,
Yeah,
because if you don't have that thought through and, have your knowledge or access to, a coach and a mentor like you can run into a lot of problems and you can shoot through a lot of capital unnecessarily if you don't have that plan really put together. Because every business that we're investing in, at the end of the day, we're providing capital so they can invest in people. Like that is the vast majority of it. Sure, there's
exactly.
some R&D dollars and some other things, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to the people. And so having that game plan together is very important. And into having access to experts like you to really think about like where's the right timing in the life cycle of the business for this type of talent pool is absolutely critical. And that's why we love to have relationships with experts like you with what we do at Hill Capital because it is strategically very, very important. And so grateful for all the work you do for entrepreneurs.
No, thank you. And right back at you. The investment space is such a critical part to so many organizations. Now, you'd said something earlier that was intriguing to me, and I didn't want to pull that string then, but I definitely do now.
Sure.
So I had thought when we'd originally spoken that you were in that kind of angel VC space and that you
Oh, sure.
were investing in companies in an effort to help them to an exit. Now I'm learning differently. Frankly, I've not heard of that before. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Would love to. So, again, my background started nearly 30 years ago, helping, companies build and grow. And I saw how fundamentally disjointed Wall Street was from Main Street. And what I mean by that is that Wall Street is not really set up to help, a lot of Main Street businesses that want to be around in 20, 30 years to build and grow because they get paid on transactions. And so if you think about private equity and even venture capital and the whole umbrella, the vast majority of the whole system is really set up to either go big or go home in transactions that
Yeah.
happen along the way. And that's all fine. But entrepreneurs, founders really need to understand that. So when myself and my co-founders of Hill Capital put together our fund, we really thought through like where and how can we structure our investments to provide what not only our LPs and our investors need, but as importantly, what do the entrepreneurs need and where are they ultimately going? Because it's really a balancing act. And so that's why we structured our investments as what we call a VC equity based note. And so it's this equity based note where we'll take equity risk, but we'll structure it so we can get paid back over time. And that's a really important piece to this because we can fund a company, help them get to profitability, get paid back, win win. And so we are not waiting or hoping or cajoling, which is really what happens most of the time in a traditional venture fund to help a company and make it sell someday for cash, because that's the only way they can return cash to their LPs over a 5 to 7 year window. And so we've structured our investments in a way that respects what both sides of the table need, and it's worked extremely well. And there are some other examples like it in the marketplace, but it's a field that is building and growing. We're big fans of, innovative finance, and there's different models out there that people are doing revenue-based financing. It's really big in the tech space because we have more reoccurring revenue where some of these models can really flourish. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, and we are really pioneering a better way to really think about investing in and supporting entrepreneurs that may not want to sell in 5 to 7 years, which is traditionally required.
That's really interesting. So, does your model still require a sale? Or if you,
No,
for example, okay, so is it a debt or equity instrument?
it's debt, but it has all equity risk.
Okay, interesting.
So what I mean by that is it's debt, it sits on the balance sheet, but we're not doing personal guarantees and all the things that one would normally associate with the word debt. I even stay away from the word debt because people have preconceived notions of what that looks like when they get debt or a loan from a bank, but it's different than that. So it's structured to be paid back over time. So that's why it is a note. And that's an important piece of that. So from a balance sheet perspective, it definitely sits on there as debt. But the key is that we're taking the risk of that business building and growing. Because if they don't, they're not going to be able to pay back the note. And that's why it's equity based, because we're taking that equity type of risk. We're really funding the execution risk that founder is going to take their business from 2 million in sales to 5 million in sales, because we're putting in $1 million to help them, hire, talented people, maybe build out some additional technology or whatever they need to typically double or triple revenue is our typical kind of our bogey that a company is utilizing our capital for. And so that's where the magic happens, is that the capital matching is to make sure that the capital is the right fit for what they're looking to achieve. And this is where we spend all of our time in underwriting, really learning and understanding to make sure this investment has a really good shot. No guarantees, of course, but it has a really good shot at helping that founder and the business get to where they want to be. And then we can get paid back and they can move on. They could go raise a venture round if they wanted to. They could own and control the business for 30 years, but we're completely fine either way.
So a successful outcome is a repaid
Yeah.
note, not an equity position.
Well, so we will have equity exposure. So it's a form of a warrant, so right to buy stock. So if a
Mhm.
company does sell, we can get, well, how we think of it as a bonus, basically a bonus payment if that were to ever occur. So that would be the best outcome, but it's not required for the business to sell. So if our capital and community helps the company build value, we'd love to, an opportunity to capture maybe some of that additional value that we'd like to believe that we had helped create. But no, at the end of the day, that note being repaid is what is successful for us. So at the end of the day, Jerry, we put in $1, we look to earn $2 to $3 back. I'm in the business of hitting singles and doubles and working with businesses that don't really fit the traditional venture capital model, that are trying to be the next, $1 billion unicorn. There's plenty of money, plenty of VCs out there chasing that stuff. We're working with companies like Mercury Mosaics that makes beautiful handmade tile, and Mercedes has been building her business for 20 years. And so, and she's got, dozens and dozens of employees and does beautiful work. And that's the type of businesses that we're investing in and supporting.
That's really exciting. So, kind of dialing back to earlier in the show, what do you look for? Because I've not heard of an investment model like this. What do you look
Yes.
for in a company?
Great question. At the end of the day, I could talk about industry and financials and so forth. Those are all key pieces. But at the end of the day, it really boils down to the people, because when things don't go right, not if, but when, because all founders and small businesses run into challenges.
Yes,
When a challenge comes up, how are they going to show up as partners? How are we going to be partners when a tough time happens? And interesting, we've now done 16 investments. We just closed our other one just last Wednesday, and that's what goes through our mind all the time, because all of our portfolio companies have run into challenges.
of course.
COVID, of course, right out of the gate affected everybody and so forth. But how are we working as partners together to see through those challenges? So a lot of our underwriting is really understanding and building the relationship with us and the founders of these businesses, because that's what really matters for us.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's a misconception among folks who aren't in the business world that success means that you don't have problems anymore. And nothing could be
Yeah.
further from the truth. If anything, your grade of problem, alas, increases. But you're right. It's how you deal with that stimulus that determines the longevity of your success.
Exactly right. And the fun thing about that is, how do people show up when challenges arise? Do they live up to get excited almost like about that? And we've seen that. We invest in a company called Go Route, and Mike Rowley is the founder. And when COVID hit, he sells technology into football teams. So his whole market shut down overnight, and all of his purchase orders were canceled because nobody knew if the football teams were going to take the field, come the fall. And actually most of them didn't, but he lived up to and aspired to the awesome entrepreneurs, and he actually took the time, invested in his sales team, and spent the time selling and building relationships with other football teams, so when the market came back, he was cooking with gas, and it was super impressive to see. And we've seen it with other companies where, like, COVID happened, people put their head in the sands and just wanted to, like, ignore it and kind of just wait, and they laid off people and just hope and prayed. And I get that too, but the really good operators really are working to be at their best, whether times are good or bad, because these things always come full circle.
Exactly. Smooth seas don't make strong sailors, and you don't make swords
Yeah.
by petting steel. It's interesting how some people rise to the occasion and other people fold under the pressure. I've got a good friend named China Morgan. She runs a company called Bidlow. She was actually on the show a couple weeks back, and her pre-COVID product. Well, her product is the same. She provides video user-generated content across platforms for companies. Prior to COVID, she was a physical kiosk at events and things like that. COVID happened, and quite obviously, physical events ceased. So she pivoted to an online app that people could utilize their phones and whatever mobile devices for. And she's rocking. She's doing great work. She's still killing it. And COVID came and it didn't kill her. She expanded.
Yeah, if I had a magic formula to kind of like really fully understand all that during underwriting, that is like the golden goose,
Then
because
you really would be
and that's
Buffett.
what that's what we're looking for. Yeah, because if you know that, and that's why what we love is I think of it as established entrepreneurs, people who've been through the meat grinder already.
Mhm.
And that's why we struggle with like true startups, where somebody is very early on, the first couple of years of an idea, because in large part they haven't been through the grinder yet. And we love when companies have and founders have, been at it for, over 10 years or at least over 5 years, and have had their setbacks. And because then we can see how did they operate and did they rise to the occasion when those setbacks happen. And that's where it gets really fun for us as investors.
No, absolutely. It's some things, and younger folks don't like to hear this, but it's a truth. Some things can only be tested over time with experience.
Yeah, that
Again,
is
it's
exactly,
so
that's
hard
absolutely
early.
true.
No, I'm sorry. It's so hard early on to know, is someone going to rise or crumble? And very often the only way to tell is you put the globe on their shoulders and see.
Yeah, yeah, well put. Good Atlas shrugged. Reference.
I am an unabashed libertarian. I will never skip an opportunity.
Might be a couple Iran books on the
Yeah.
shelf.
I'm a producer, not a taker. Anyway, no, so what I'm hearing from you is your ideal prospect for your fund is someone who's been around 5+ years, that has a product or service that's been tested, and
Very
maybe
much so.
doesn't fit that traditional VC model.
Yeah, most of our entrepreneurs, they've been a little burned out because they can't get all the money they need from a bank, and their business model doesn't really fit what VCs in particular, but even most angel investors are really looking for,
Mhm.
meaning that they probably don't have a high likelihood that they can have at least a 10x return on their investment. And so that's the type of companies that we're investing in, are companies where they're taking way more execution risk than they are concept risk. And they're really on a path to being profitable, because being profitable and cash flow positive is really about freedom of choice to choose what they want to do going forward. They may want to bring in more money to grow it even bigger, but they may want to just continue to operate it as a nice cash flowing business. But those are the companies that we're investing in. typically companies are doing a couple million in revenue and are trying to get to, 7 to 10 million in revenue. That's our bread and butter. But we have invested in a handful of companies that have been well under a million in revenue when we've invested. So we always take introductions. My team always meets with every founder and entrepreneur for at least a half hour, get to know them, learn about what they're doing. And if it's not a fit for us, look at we're members of several angel groups. We can refer them, help them out, introduce them to other investors that we know. We send them all the resources that we have. So we always white glove every relationship because there's really nobody I respect more in the ecosystem than entrepreneurs. So we work our tails off to, because we're like every other fund. We can only invest in so many companies. There's only so much we can do. But for, the vast majority of them that it's not a fit today, we help them wherever we can in their journey.
Yeah, I love everything about that description. I will admit, when I'm talking to serial founders or people that have been in the space for a long time, if
Yeah.
the first people that they don't invite to their new entity aren't the folks they've known forever, I always ask myself, would I want to interact with you? Do you have a professional network? You've been doing this for a long time. You see that again and again. And I have very few regrets. I've had a blessed career. I have very few regrets, but one of them for sure is I didn't put more effort into building my professional network earlier on. Because
Yeah,
gosh,
that's a really good point, and and that's why actually I in the book I write about building a community and why it's really important for everyone, no matter where they're at, starting up or in the latter part of their career, but to always be building those that community, building the support around them, and so. That is why, I'm a Rotarian. I go to my local Rotary meetings. I'm a member of Entrepreneurs Organization, EO. I lean into these types of things because it is really important to build and develop these relationships because you never know where and how they become valuable. And I think it's really important. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of founders that think it's a waste of time. And I always encourage them to think differently about that because they're also the ones that grouse that there's no capital for them or there's no one there to help them and so forth. And it's like, well, have you given first? Are you a go-giver? Have you gone out and, volunteered at the local Rotary barbecue and stuff like that and developed some of these relationships? Because that's what it takes. You have to give first and you have to help people first before you can really expect somebody else to help you, I think.
100% agree. I feel exactly the same way. I belong to a couple different communities, and the majority of the entrepreneurs, those like Thrive and Tribe are the two that are coming to mind. The majority of the entrepreneurs that I interact with are either at the ideation stage or they're at the 3 to 5 employee stage. Most of
Yes.
those folks will never grow to the point, I don't say that in a hurtful way, to the point that they would ever engage me. But number one, to your point, I love this community. Small business is the engine of our economy. It's the core of where most innovation happens. I'm passionate about this community. Number two, on the selfish side, I'm planting seeds because in a year, 2 years, 3 years, I would like some of those folks to come back to me when they are ready to work with me.
Exactly. That's
Oh,
exactly how we think about it when we meet with entrepreneurs. Because before, when we were talking about this, I said it's not a fit today. So actually, in our contact database, we mark things as on the shelf because we acknowledge it's not a pass, it's not a no, it's not a fit today. And we hope to take it off the shelf someday and revisit to invest. And actually, we've a number of our investments, including Mercury Mosaics. It's because when we first talked to them, it wasn't a fit for either party, and that was fine. And a couple of years went by, and then we ended up making an investment. And so that's how we think about relationship building.
100% yes. And I think that's the way it should be with any high touch service. Um,
Yeah.
you know, gosh, I don't use the term because it sounds silly, but when I was in the Marines, we used to do a type of workout called a fartlek workout, which is, I believe, a Norse or Swedish word. But basically, we'd get on a track and we would sprint the straightaways and then we would jog the corners, and we do that for
Ah,
miles and
okay.
miles. And the power of it was both strength conditioning and cardiovascular workout. And I look at consulting on the high end and what you're doing on the high end the same way. It's not a sprint, it's not a marathon, it's both. because if they're not a
Yes.
match today, we're going to stay in touch until some of them become. But when they get there, then it's a sprint. We've got to get things done.
And I'm guessing that's how you think about this as being a destination employer as well,
Yes,
and how you treat your employers or prospective employees on, if they come to you and it's not a fit today. Am I correct in my thinking there, Jerry?
100%, because nobody cares what you think or what you tell them you can do until they know you care about their outcome. And
Yeah, I love that.
being a destination employer, which is a company that's established a reputation in the marketplace as a location for top talent who, just 10x their careers, they make it clear from the first interaction that, hey, Patrick, you and I aren't going to work together if our goals and missions don't align, because ultimately neither one of us will be happy. But if they do, and you come aboard, while I will ask a lot from you, I will give more.
Yep.
So I don't
Yep.
know that it's true today of these organizations. So I'm speaking historically when I say about it. But places like Apple and Google used to be. Places like Harvard, places like McKinsey. If you're a technologist at Apple and Google, you knew your career was going to blow up. If you're an academic at Harvard or MIT, having that on your resume was an intro to any organization after that. If you're a business consultant, spending 2-3 years at McKinsey is going to blow your career up after, which is why when you go to LinkedIn, you see ex Google, ex Apple, ex McKinsey,
Yeah.
because they know.
Right.
And that's what this is all
Right.
about.
Well, I hope that it happens someday. It would be X Hill Capital Corporation.
Well, I would love to make sure that happens. That's a conversation for another day. But listen, Patrick, it's very obvious you and I could talk all night. So
Yes, indeed.
deference of this not becoming a Joe Rogan 3-hour marathon, let's wrap things up here. But I will say this, I would love to have you on again. And any folks that are listening or watching, if you've got questions to Patrick, we're going to get his info in a minute. You can reach out. You can also reach out to me if you've got, anything you'd like to have him back on the show for. But with that said, Patrick, folks that do want to learn more about Hill Capital, that do have questions about things we talked about today, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Well, my book is Breakout Valuation. So you can simply email me at patrick@breakoutvaluation.com. That's the easiest way. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so you feel free to connect there, and just please in the notes reference that we heard each other on Business Mastery, and happy to connect and link and do what I can to be helpful for people.
Awesome. So those contact info pieces will be in the show notes as always. So if you're watching us on YouTube, click there. If you're listening on Apple or Google or Spotify, they'll be in those as well. Patrick, I thank you very much for your time. It was a wonderful talk, and I look forward to this going live.
Likewise. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you for everybody for listening today.
Outstanding. And folks out in the audience, as always, until next week, continue to build awesome things and incredible companies. And we look forward to seeing you out there in the audience again.